Thank you for joining us. My name is Barry Erickson, and I'm Community Engagement Coordinator here at Wheaton Public Library. Tonight, we are delighted and excited to bring you this presentation, Andy Warhol, The American Dream. Justin Witte is the director and curator of the Cleve Carney Museum of Art. He was the former exhibition manager at Columbia College in Chicago and has worked at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, and was a member and membership president of an influential Philadelphia Artist Cooperative. He received his MFA in studio art from the University of Illinois at Chicago in 2007, where he was a university fellow. And he's also a past recipient of the Pew Fellowship. So please join me in welcoming Justin Witte.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming out here tonight and for watching from home or from work or while you're walking your dog or wherever you happen to be at the moment. My name is Justin Witte, and I am here to talk tonight about Andy Warhol. Now, what I like to say whenever I talk about any artist, or really anyone, is that people's lives are so complex and there's so many branches that come off and paths that come off from their lives. So what I'm going to try to provide you with is an arc of understanding of where Andy came from, why his story was uniquely an American story, and why he became one of the most famous artists of the 20th century. Now, I'm not going to talk about the favorite foods his cats ate, or a holiday he maybe got sick eating Chinese food. I don't know. All those side stories I'm not going to share. So if I do leave something out that you're hoping to hear, I do apologize. What we're looking at right now is a picture of probably Andy Warhol's greatest achievement, and that was appearing as a guest star on The Love Boat in 1985. The premise of this episode is that Andy was playing himself on The Love Boat, and a passenger played by Tom Bosley and his wife were also on The Love Boat, and Andy wanted to do one of his famous portraits of Tom Bosley's wife, and it made Tom Bosley uncomfortable because Andy was this odd artistic character, and that was the whole idea of the show. And I start with this slide because growing up, this is how I knew of Andy Warhol. Right? I knew he was an artist, but he was more like a celebrity stand-in for artists. He symbolized artists in popular culture, right? He was on talk shows. He was on The Love Boat. He had his own show on MTV, but he was just this celebrity where his fame came from art. But I didn't really know a lot about his work. And I think a lot of people today still don't know a lot about his work, but know him as this famous artist. And he's incredibly famous. I think one way to point at how much Andy has really permeated our culture is this image. This is an image from an end cap at a Target grocery store from 2012. And it's displaying a number of Campbell's soup cans that were made especially to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Andy Warhol's show at the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles of Campbell's soup cans. So I think this is so amazing because in honor of that show in which Andy Warhol broke the copyright of Campbell's Soup for his own profit, Campbell's Soup then paid the Andy Warhol Foundation for the right to use their own label on their soup in his honor. So not only does that show how much he has permeated our culture, but how successful he has become, but how much his work has become so recognizable that Campbell's Soup is more of a stand-in for Warhol than it is for soup. But of course, Andy wasn't always this well known, and he didn't really come from a position of a lot of privilege and fame. He was born in 1928 to parents Andre and Julia Warhola. Andrew Warhola was his name at birth, and he was born in industrial Pittsburgh. So we see on the left here what his neighborhood would look like. As a young child, he moved around into several apartments with his family in the neighborhood called the Hills and also the Run, small kind of ramshackle apartments because his parents were immigrants to the United States and they were trying to establish themselves in this country. They came from a small area in Eastern Europe near Slovakia, and Andy was the youngest of 3 sons. So you can imagine this neighborhood, which was situated right behind the steel mills in Pittsburgh, was kind of a tough area. A lot of the parents were working class, trying to better their families' lives, and were away from the home. And kids were often left to fend for themselves. And we see young Andy on the right here, didn't necessarily do well in that environment. He wasn't as into some of the sports or activities that other boys his age are into. He was also somewhat sickly. He suffered from rosacea and other ailments, and actually at age 8 developed what is commonly called St. Vitus dance disease, which is a neurological disorder that caused him to have tremors and seizures. And it's because of that disease that he was actually pulled out of school to be homeschooled by his mother, Julia. And as he was homeschooled, he still had a lot of free time to fill. And his mother was very aware of Andy's talents. Julia Warhol was actually an artist herself. And she encouraged all of her sons to do drawings and actually had drawing contests between them. And the winner of each drawing contest would get a piece of chocolate. But Andy, who was home a lot, she encouraged him to develop a kind of his artistic side, but also his other interests. And one thing Andy was really interested in was popular culture and celebrity culture. So I can speak from my own experience. My father and his family immigrated to the United States. And I think if there's anyone in this family who also has that experience, they know when you come to a new country or this country, one of the easiest ways or most accessible ways to learn about this new place you live is through popular culture. Through the movies, films, television, radio. That becomes a textbook in which you learn what a culture prioritizes, how people speak, how they dress, how they look, what they aspire to. And Andy really delved into learning about that culture through picture play magazines, which are old kind of movie magazines that featured all the stars from the 1930s, but also going to movies. And at that time, movie theaters would hand out headshots of stars of movies to people coming to the theater. Andy would, with the help of his mother, would send off those photos to be signed by the celebrities. And he began this kind of collection of signed celebrity photographs. On the left here, we see his most prized possession, which he kept throughout his life, which is a signed photograph from Shirley Temple, one of his favorite actresses. Now, I mentioned that his mother, Julia Warhol, was also an artist. And in fact, she collaborated with him throughout his life and lived with him in New York for much of his life. So when you see in some of Andy's early work, his illustration work, you'll see this really looping handwritten script. That was often his mother actually writing on it. He loved her handwriting. And I bring that up now because our assistant curator, Julia Walker, and I were looking at this photo, and we noticed, hey, you know, that signature on the photo looks a lot like Julia Warhol's handwriting. So I'm wondering if maybe she supported him in a lot of ways he didn't know about as well. So from an early age, he was being exposed to this culture that he would mine for his artwork, and that would really not only help define what he made, but really be the platform in which he excelled in this country. But at the same time, there were other key influences that he was experiencing with his mother as a child in Pittsburgh. And on the left, you see a key one. Julia Warhol would bring Andy to Mass up to 4 times a week at their neighborhood church. They were Byzantine Catholics, and this is actually the front of the St. John Chrysostom Church in Pittsburgh in which they attended. And you see the front of that church is covered in this beautiful and intricate screen and wall containing iconic paintings and religious scenes, beautiful ornate woodwork and depictions from scripture. And you also see in this picture the brilliant and beautiful colors that were not only in the paintings, but surrounded in the architecture of that building. So imagine a young Andy being brought multiple times a week into this setting, a setting in which the priest would often lead the services from behind that screen, with the idea that the focus shouldn't be on an individual, but it should be about what was being said, but also the religious images on display. So Andy was staring at these really rich, intricate paintings that were examples of how an individual, a saint, or a religious icon can be used as a stand-in for a community's ideals, for their beliefs, for their aspirations. And that is also something that really carried throughout his work. So you have this immigrant child who's come to this country. He's seeing how his parents are working so hard, and he starts to get this kind of two-fisted reality of American culture that's sometimes contradictory, obsession with celebrity, popular culture, and fame, but also deep beliefs, religiosity, and kind of community. Andy's father, Andre Warhol, also recognized Andy's talents at a young age and actually bought him a camera when he was young, but also set aside money in a postal bond for him to go to college at some point, because he realized that Andy probably wouldn't go into construction like he worked in, or maybe wouldn't find some of the traditional jobs that other young men were finding in Pittsburgh, and wanted to make sure that his talents were nurtured. That ended up being incredibly, showed a lot of its foresight, because when Andy was in high school in 1942, his father, Andre, was away at a construction site in West Virginia. He often worked with crews that moved buildings, and he was in West Virginia with a crew that was moving a building. And the entire crew drank contaminated water on the work site. They all got terribly sick, and they all recovered except for Andy's father, who died from liver failure because of that exposure. His father was brought home and laid to rest in the house for several days, as was tradition in their church. Andy was very traumatized by the event and was unable to look at his father when he was laid out in the household, and actually hid under his bed throughout the process. Shortly after his father died, his mother came down with colon cancer. And she actually went in for treatment, and she survived, but she was away from the house for a long period of time. And Andy and his brothers took care of each other. There's kind of a story that they would often make dinner for each other, and that often consisted of canned soup. That's just one of the many myths that surround the origins of a lot of Andy's work. But both of those incidences planted a seed of kind of fear of hospitals, and also of concern about health that would also follow Andy throughout his life. Andy continued to develop artistically. His mother had enrolled him in free art classes as he was a young child at the Carnegie Institute. And it was at that university that he was accepted in 1942 when he graduated, or 1945 when he graduated high school. And Andy quickly established himself as a talented student, but also someone who was didn't have any problem kind of poking fun at authority, that had a very sharp wit, and often tried things in a different way. As you can tell by this piece that he made while in school, entitled Nose Picker 1, Why I Pick on Me, originally titled The Lord Gave Me My Face, But I Can Pick My Own Nose, 1948 Tempera on Board. Now that personality and skill worked well with some of Andy's faculty and kind of rubbed some of them the wrong way. So he started school in 1945. After the first year, a lot of GIs were coming back from World War II. And because of the GI Bill, a lot of colleges had to let these returning GIs into their programs, and they didn't have room for all of the incoming students and existing students. And Andy's class was told that a number of students would have to leave to make room for these new students. And because of Andy's grades weren't ideal, and because of the feeling of some of the faculty that weren't too happy with him, he was told that he may have to leave the program. But he was given a chance to take a summer drawing course. And if he did well in that course, he could retain his position. So over the summer, he actually worked with his brother on the streets of Pittsburgh, and he did a series of beautiful drawings of vegetable and fruit vendors throughout the city. And those drawings impressed faculty so much that he not only stayed at the school, but he also earned a scholarship from them. But we were that close to having Andy Warhol, the construction worker, and not the artist. When Andy went back to school, he met one of the new students who were there on the GI Bill named Philip Pearlstein. Philip Pearlstein has also become a very well-known artist, actually just recently passed away. He's known for his very detailed figurative paintings and drawings. And as a young man, Philip Pearlstein had received a lot of attention for his work. He had won a national art prize, and his work had been featured in national magazines. Andy, being aware of that, approached him when he started school and asked him what it felt like to be famous. Philip responded that, well, it only lasts 5 minutes. So a possible another origin of one of the famous sayings of Andy Warhol, just 1/3 as important, I would guess. So when Andy graduated college, he moved to New York with Philip Pearlstein, both with the idea that they were going to set out and start their careers. So in 1949, he arrives in New York City. Now, I think this is fascinating because when you think Andy Warhol, you probably think 1960s, 70s, 1980s, because he was such a prominent figure in those periods, right? But really get a sense of the range of time in which he was operating and had influence, as you'll see, is pretty remarkable. For him to show up in New York in 1949, and you see Andy, a young Andy here on the streets of New York. And from that point on, to be so involved in creative culture up until his death in the 80s is pretty fascinating. But when Andy arrived, he did not initially have the idea or the opportunity to exist as a fine artist. It's not like someone was waiting, like, have a show, and here's a museum show. And he understood that. And he understood that he really had to work for his success. Because of his upbringing, he saw how hard it was to gain success. And he knew that he wanted that success that he saw in these magazines that he looked at as a child. So he began to work as a commercial artist, as an illustrator and a graphic designer. And one thing really played in his favor is that he had developed an illustration style that really was very popular and garnered a lot of attention. And it relied on a technique called the blotted line technique of drawing. And what that is if you do a drawing with like an ink pen and put a lot of ink on the drawing, so it's very thick, kind of pooling up on the surface of the paper, you can then take another paper and lay it on top of that initial one, and it'll leave like a print of that drawing. And you can do it several times. Andy would do that and then color in the drawings or add script, or sometimes have his mother add the script. And the effect was the line work in the drawings, in the illustrations, had this irregular, undulating line that was very playful and fun, but also very graphic, because essentially it was a form of printmaking, right? And because it was so graphic, it translated very well to magazines and newspapers and advertisements. And Andy quickly developed a lot of clients who were interested in his work. He was also an incredibly hard worker. He would come to clients with multiple ideas, solutions to their problems, what they were trying to do. He would go back and change things if they needed to be changed. But he was not without his quirks, right? He wore kind of intentionally schleppy clothes, and that garnered him the nickname of Raggedy Andy. And when he delivered his final pieces, they weren't in nice, clean portfolios. They were often in brown paper bags. So he was also called Paper Bag Andy. But he was doing so well, and he was such a hard worker that he started working for clients such as Tiffany, Dior, Bonwit Teller, Harper's Bazaar. And he gained a lot of success, so much so that by the end of the 50s, he was probably one of the most famous illustrators in the country. He was making an equivalent then to what today would be $540,000 a year from illustration, which is pretty phenomenal if any of you have ever worked in any arts whatsoever. I think if you translate that to a real job, it's like $18 billion a year. I'm not sure. That allowed him to buy his own house on the Upper East Side. He started to collect furniture and artwork, but he wasn't content. He always had this idea that he wanted to be on the same platform as a fine artist, to be recognized in that same level, to reach that sort of fame. And he had tried. In 1954, he had an exhibition at the Hugo Gallery that was a number of drawings based on the written works of Truman Capote. So 1954, the predominant movement in the US that was getting a lot of attention was abstract expressionism, right? So think Jackson Pollock, Drips on a Canvas, Willem de Kooning, large paintings that were focused on the painting as object, as the brushstroke, as expression in and of itself, non-representational, very heroic, very brooding inward. And Andy was showing single line drawings, portraits of people related to the writings of Truman Capote. It didn't quite mix what was going on, what was people were interested in. So he didn't find his way into the fine art world. Well, in the early 60s, everything kind of changed, as they often do. A movement that started in Britain came over to the United States, and that art movement was pop art. So pop art, as its name suggests, derives from popular culture. And pop artists, in some way, who are pushing against kind of this academic and opaque form of art making that you saw in abstract expressionism, decided to make works that used imagery from popular culture, from advertising, from comic books as the subject of their work, and also methods that were often used in commercial image production, like silkscreen, or the use of Ben-Day dots in the construction of paintings in the creation of their work. Now, there's lots of ideas behind this. One, like I said, it's definitely a pushback. Cultural pendulums often swing back and forth with groups pushing against the ideals of the previous. But at the same time, their idea of taking everyday objects and lifting them to the level of fine art, taking the mundane and entering into the world of fine art. The idea behind that, one is saying, hey, these are the things that make up our visual landscape. They should have just as much value as anything else. These are things that everyone has access to, so it's not as kind of elitist as previous movements. But also it's a reflection of culture. These are the images, the objects, and the ideals we're producing. Why shouldn't our art also reflect that? And the visual impact of these blown up large scale, so you see like Roy Lichtenstein's large comic book based paintings on the left, or Klaus Oldenburg, who you may know from his giant spoons with cherries or clothespin sculptures, started making soft sculptures of like hamburgers and cake and hot dogs and toothpaste and things like that. They were also so kind of energetic and bold and wildly different that they stood out in a period in American history, the 1960s, when people were looking for alternatives, looking for changes, looking for things that were radical, right? So pop art really caught on, and it caught on with Andy as well. He recognized within this movement a lot that he related to and began to change some of the artwork that he was working on. So in 1961, he showed a series of paintings that were based on comic books, pages, ads from newspapers, and he showed them in a venue that a lot of artists in the time used to explore really creative ideas, and that was in storefront windows. So Bonwit Teller was one of the largest retailers in the country and in New York City. They had a store on Fifth Avenue. It was located where the Trump Tower is now today. And they were known for having really cutting edge artists come in to do their window displays. So Salvador Dali, Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, just to name a few. Andy had done a window for them previously during a summer slot. And when he was offered another spot in 1961, he used it as an opportunity to show these new paintings. So behind the back image here, you see behind some of these mannequins in their kind of Jackie O outfits, the size and scale of some of these paintings that Warhol was working on. Now, you also see in these paintings that even though they're taken from, on the left, the Superman from a comic book, or before and after one, an ad for cosmetic surgery, there are certain things that show that this is a painting, right? And not an ad or a comic book page. And that's like the drips and the splatters and the overpainting. And he was intentionally doing that to give that wink, like, well, yeah, this is a Superman page, but it's a painting, you know, the scale. There's that hint. And that's kind of a method a lot of artists still use today. That drip, that splatter, that intentional mark somehow separates it from its original form. Shortly after making these paintings, he started to experiment with a series of paintings of Coca-Cola bottles. And he did some that had those drips and marks and splatters. And he decided to do some that were very crisp and clean, almost direct representations of the objects. And he, always a marketer, having been in marketing so long in his career, went around to different gallerists and artists and critics and showed them the two, asking which one they reacted to more. And they all reacted to the clean, tight edge representation of the Coke bottles. Because if you're going to take that object and lift it to the level of fine art, why do you need to apologize? Why do you have to do that wink that it's a painting? Why not just present that image? And so in 1962, when he was given a show at the Blum Gallery in Los Angeles, he decided to do 32 paintings, one each of the flavors of Campbell's soup. And he did it in this new clean, crisp style using stencil, but also hand painting. He sent the paintings to the gallery where the gallery manager, Blum, received them. He was unable to hang them straight, so gave up on it and put them all on a shelf in the gallery. And the show caused quite a stir. People wondered why he painted soup cans. He said, well, I have soup every day for lunch. He was always very mysterious about his intentions because he knew that if he kept his answers minimal, the viewers would start to fill in what they liked about the work. Again, always marketing himself. There's stories that he actually paid another artist to give him ideas what to paint, $50, and suggested he paint things that he loved, like money and soup. And so maybe that's behind it. But whatever the reason, the show really gained a lot of attention because it was so bold. Remember, at the time, we're used to now seeing artwork in this vein. It may not be what you like. It may still seem like out of the ordinary to some, but we know this kind of work that borrows imagery from other sources, work that incorporates commercial text or imagery. We're familiar with it. At this time, it was still incredibly radical. And then on top of that, to show a bunch of just soup cans where the only difference is the flavor, perhaps that's a reflection of a commentary on art. It's kind of all the same package, just with a different title. And then to be shown on this brilliant solution of a shelf, right, which replicates how soup is stolen in the store. What a great mistake that was. It gained a lot of attention, not all of it good. All right, local news, the LA newspaper kind of panned the show. There were cartoonists who made fun of it. Other galleries in the area bought actual soup and did displays and said, come see ours, it's cheaper. But Andy understood that all that attention was good. So when the newspaper came to take photos of these other galleries showing their soup, he agreed to pose with it. He knew he could get that attention. And it was after this show that he really established himself on a national level as one of the leading pop artists in the country. And a year later, he continued his evolution and began to incorporate a tool that came to really define his work the rest of his career, and that is the use of silkscreen. For anyone who's not totally sure what silkscreen is, for the 8,000 people in the room that you can't see, it's a massive audience, and everyone at home, silkscreen essentially is if you have a stretched mesh screen over a frame, and then you cover that with a photographic emulsion, right? And then you take an image that's on a transparency, either printed on a transparent plastic, or if you take a photo and treat it with mineral spirit so it becomes transparent, and the only things that light doesn't go through are kind of the black lines that define that image. You lay that image on a light box, put the screen over it, turn on that light. Everywhere that the light hits, so meaning everywhere that's not covered by the black of that image, hardens because it has that photographic emulsion. Everywhere that's hidden by that black does not harden. So when you take the screen back off, spray it with water, everywhere where there was a black part of that image washes out. So if you press ink through it, it creates a reproduction of that image, okay? So that is the way that they produced text and posters and things in the commercial art world. And he began to incorporate that in his artwork. And one of the first paintings he did with it was this portrait of Marilyn Monroe called Golden Marilyn, created right after she had passed away. Now, Andy obviously was very aware of Marilyn Monroe, being so in tune with movie stars and celebrity, but also because everyone was. She was probably the most famous starlet in the world at that time. And he decided to present her image, a single image that's a cropped photo taken from the publicity still from the film Niagara. And he put it on this golden ground. It's named Golden Marilyn. Now, if we think back to that image of his church that he attended growing up, we see all those brightly colored paintings, religious icons on these golden backgrounds, right? Singular central portraits. So there is a direct connection between those two. And you have to ask yourself, what is in that choice, right? Why present Maryland in the same way? Well, Andy has grown up now and lived and operated in this culture where he's seen what kind of ideals American culture puts forward, who we put forward as our icons, and they are celebrities, they are stars, they are successful people like Marilyn Monroe. At the same time, Marilyn Monroe was a very tragic figure, right? She was someone whose celebrity kind of overtook her life. She became so famous that her identity and really her image were used by movie producers, by husbands, by relationships, in ways that kind of got out of control. And ultimately, you could argue that led to her tragic death. She kind of lost that control because the celebrity was over top. So also in a way, she was a martyr in a way to celebrity. But then if you think about in context of the work that he had shown the Ferris Gallery of soup cans. So there he's lifting up these mundane everyday objects. Soup cans is art. Part of that is saying, this is what our culture produces and sells, these objects, this processed food. I'm just reflecting that as an artist. What's another big product that our culture produces and sells? Celebrity, fame. It's just another product that's presented. So all these things are weaving through this work. And at the same time, just a year later, he started this other series of works that were not as popular as previous pieces. Very large canvases from his Death and Disaster series, where he was taking images, in some cases, of car crashes and repeating them over and over again on the canvas. So this is 1963, pre-Ralph Nader. Cars are these big hulking steel boxes cruising down the road. And when there were accidents, they were brutal. But oftentimes these brutal accidents were photographed and then published in the daily paper for people to kind of ogle at, right? And when you see them in the daily paper, it's horrible, it's tragic, but you turn the page and that's the news, you go about your day. When we think about the news that we take in every day, we have to, just for our own sanity, kind of compartmentalize it as separate from our everyday, because otherwise it becomes overwhelming. But in this way, in this painting, where Andy's taken the same image from one car crash and repeated it over and over and over again, he's reflecting that repetition of these type of images that we see on a regular basis and condensing them into one image. And the effect is really overwhelming. People did not like these for obvious reasons. It's hard to look at it over and over and over again. But in a way, just like soup can or celebrity, this is also something that our culture was producing and putting forward, right? Tragedy is one of the leading aspects of news, right? If it bleeds, it leads. And he was also presenting that as something being produced. But that didn't mean he wasn't still doing fun things as well. He ventured into sculpture in 1963, 64. And this is the Brillo box sculptures, and it is based on the shipping container that the smaller Brillo boxes came in. And Andy just loved the graphic design. Now you see these boxes, which are hand painted and then silk screen, do have some tells still that it is artist made, as the registration is slightly off on the bottom edge. On the shorter side, you see the kind of like the zigzag lines around the 3 cents off or slightly off registration. But Andy really liked that graphic design and also wanted to lift that up as fine art. And he also liked the works because they were easily storable and shippable. A lot of the same reasons that Brillo liked them as well. Now, because Andy was working on all these new projects, and especially his paintings that were incredibly large, he employed a lot of assistants to help him make the work, to carry the screens, to pull the screens, and he would kind of direct the paintings. And that drew a lot of criticism too. One, here's this artist who's now taking pre-existing images and using them as a subject matter in his work. And now he's developing a style where his assistants are doing a lot of the actual work of producing it. And people still today is like, well, how is that art? Because often we evaluate the value of art based on the labor we perceive it took to create it, right? If you see something that's incredibly detailed, you're like, wow, that must have taken a lot of time. And we put value on the time, as we should. But people being confronted with like, well, this is a pre-existing image. and he has other people making it. It doesn't fit with this value network that we've established to evaluate art. Well, Andy was ahead of his time in this way, as he was in a lot of ways. He was already living in society where he was surrounded by numerous existing images every day, newspapers, magazines, television. Society was already being kind of flooded with imagery. And all that imagery had symbolism and meaning, and people understood it, and it formed a shared language, lexicon. And he understood, well, I can use that as my source as well. I can use these images that we all know and see to create work, because that's using a language that already exists in society. And the use of assistance, it was just the logical way to produce. He understood, coming from commercial art, that it was an effective way to create work. But also there's an intentionality of removing himself from that process, because if his focus was the idea behind the work should be able to exist on its own too, separate from this idea of the hand that made it. So it was radical, it was avant-garde, it was pushing the limits, but there's intentionality to it. And people were very curious about this artist doing these new things. And when Andy started to have these larger studios with assistants, people would come and they'd see all these helpers, and they began to nickname his studios the factory, because it looked like a factory setup, how they set things up. Now, there were numerous different factories as the studio moved around, but it always retained that name, the factory. And probably the most famous was his factory studio on 47th Street that the studio manager, Billy Name, had covered in silver paint and tin foil and silver, and it became known as the Silver Factory. And the Silver Factory, like many of the other studios he had after that, not only was a place for the creation of his work, but a lot of celebrities, people seeking out kind of counterculture, people just interested would gravitate to that space because it was viewed as like a happening space. And there would be concerts, there would be light shows, there would be other events. Andy famously was the producer and short-term manager of the band The Velvet Underground. He helped launch that band, designed their first famous album cover, right, with the banana on the front. That all came out of this factory scene as well. And the other thing that was happening in the factory is it became the center of where Andy started to experiment with yet another new form of art making, and that was film. Around this time, film became just slightly more affordable. So it wasn't just relegated to the big movie houses and theaters. And so Andy got more affordable cameras and started to make films. Now, he really wanted to be a famous filmmaker. But in like everything he did, he pushed the edges, pushed the boundaries of a medium to see what it could mean. So his films were very different. He filmed the Empire State Building for 8 or 6 hours straight, just the Empire State Building. It's called Empire. Is that Empire of Capitalism? Is that Empire State Building? What is it about? But it's durational. You have to sit through it and watch it. It's about time. Time is what film's about. It's just saying, okay, this is about time. How do I really push that boundary? Or a film of someone sleeping. 8 hours, someone sleeping. Kiss, people kissing. And these films were as divisive as they were curious, right? But this was the time beginning of experimental filmmaking. He also did films that had loose structure. They were pretty wild. But because all this experimentation was drawing attention, and actually people still refer to his films and study his films because they kind of broke new ground and explored new ground of what film could be. And he helped laid a lot of groundwork for experimental and later independent film as well. So it's actually very important. And what it also did is people who maybe wanted a foot into the film world were also drawn to the factory and to Andy Warhol, thinking that maybe he'd become one of his superstars, the stars that he called, that appeared in his films. And one of those people was Valerie Solanas. Valerie Solanas was a playwright, and she was she's described often as a radical feminist. I don't necessarily like that description because I think it easily associates radicalism with feminism, which I don't necessarily agree with. But she had very strong ideas that were extreme in that within that framework. And she had written a play that she presented to Andy Warhol asking him to produce. She had been in the factory scene. She was kind of a known person in that scene. Andy read the play and it was so kind of intense that he had no interest in producing it whatsoever. Time passed. She asked for the manuscript back. He had lost it. And he said, oh, I'm so sorry, Valerie. Here, I'll tell you what, we're going to give you $50 and you can be in one of my films. Okay, everything's fine. But as time went on, she became obsessed with this fact. And we now know that she suffered from a lot of untreated mental disorders, including schizophrenia. And she was convinced Andy was trying to control her life and had taken the manuscript as part of that plot. So on June 3rd, 1968, she went to the factory studio, which was in Union Square at that time, waited for Andy to arrive. He came up the elevator. When he got out, he went to his desk area to answer a phone. And when he reached to answer the phone, she pulled out a gun and shot him numerous times. She hit every vital organ in his body except his heart. She shot an assistant in the gallery, attempted to shoot another individual by the elevator, but her gun jammed, she left, and then turned herself into police. This is actually a photo that was just discovered in the last couple of decades during research. I think it was found actually by Blake Gopnik, who was one of the lecturers already at the Warhol show, excuse me. And it's the scene in the studio right after Andy was shot. So there is kind of a wood desk on the right where he was answering the phone. When he shot, he fell against the other desk that's supported by those file cabinets, kind of knocking it to the side. In the upper left corner of the space, just to the right of that white chair facing the wall, you'll see a little line, and you maybe can make out that that's an arrow. That's actually tape marking where one of the bullets lodged itself in the wall. Andy was taken to the hospital where he was pronounced dead on arrival. His heart had stopped beating. They found out that this is this famous artist, Andy Warhol. So they brought in the top surgeon and they performed hours-long experimental surgery, and they actually saved his life. He was revived, but he had been medically dead. The event left him incredibly scarred, both physically, but also emotionally as well. On the right, we see a painting by the wonderful painter Alice Neal. This painting is actually from the 70s, but it shows kind of the scars it left on Andy's body, this portrait of Andy Warhol. He also had to wear girdles to support his internal organs because there's so much damage to that part of his body. Now, I say it also had an effect on him otherwise. After he recovered from the shooting, his studio and the factory scene changed dramatically. No longer was it this open-doored space gathering for counterculture, people coming in and out. There was a steel door in the front. It was bulletproof. He had a very small staff of assistants, and he became incredibly focused on his work and creating work that could financially support all of his projects. So although he kept making work that was very avant-garde, that really pushed the boundaries in terms of painting, in terms of subject matter, he also began to work on things that he was intent on making money from and making successful as a business. One of them was beginning Interview Magazine. So Interview Magazine, I know as a youth, is one of the leading cultural magazines. It covers what's going on in art, in dance, in fashion, in movies, and it featured these great covers with these headshots of famous celebrities. And it looks very similar actually to the picture play magazines he looked at as a child. These magazines also served as a helpful tool for Andy, because since he was no longer having these large gatherings in his studios, he still wanted access to famous people and important people and interesting people. And this magazine gave him that access because he would go do interviews, whether it was going to the White House to interview Nancy Reagan in the 80s or going to speak to the top movie star. This gave him that access, and it was access that he also used to start selling his portraits. Now, a lot of people associate Andy only with portraits. Andy started really focusing on creating portraits as a way to support his studio. And what he would do is either invite or be asked by different important people or people with means to create a portrait for them. And they would come to the studio and he would take numerous Polaroid photos of them of different angles. He would have them wear kind of like a very dramatic white makeup to highlight their features, because again, from the photos, he was going to make silk screens. So the more contrast in the image, the better, right? They would choose the ones that were the most flattering. Then he would go maybe make some changes, maybe tighten up a chin line, very much in the mode of classic portraiture. And then he would use those photos to make silk screens and make his silk screen paintings. Here's one we see from the 80s of Queen Elizabeth. I just think it's a great one. That's why I use it as an example. But he was always a businessman. So when people would come to look at or pick up their portraits, there'd be the one that they paid $25,000 for. But maybe on the wall behind it, they'd notice 6 more in different colors and variations. And he's like, oh yeah, well, I'll tell you what, you can have additional ones for only $15,000 each. And that's why so often we see when he had portraits, there's so many of them, because he did these options, these variations of them, because he was a savvy business person. But I mentioned at the same time he was doing that, very much embracing kind of the business side and working to succeed in that and applying his trade and skills that he developed as a commercial artist to his fine art. He was also continuing to experiment. He had controversial shows with large-scale portraits of Chairman Mao and the Little Red Book, the Communist Manifesto, at a time when there was a lot of fear of the growing kind of power of China and communism. He did pieces focused on depicting guns or knives that reflected the ongoing violence in culture. And he also famously in the 80s began collaborating with with different young kind of up and coming artists. Now, Andy was not naive. He understood that if he began making work with the really young and hip artists, there's another way to stay in the spotlight, right? But there's something else that happened in these collaborations. So most famously, he did a series of collaborations with the young artist, Jean-Michel Basquiat. Basquiat was an artist who was already showing at the time. You may have seen the film Basquiat, and it suggests that Warhol somehow discovered him at some party. That really wasn't the case. Basquiat grew up in a middle-class family, grew up going to museums, understood art, and had actually begun showing his work. And it wasn't until he started to get attention that Andy became aware of him. But Basquiat's style was very much influenced by street art. It was very energetic. And it was gaining a lot of attention in the 80s. And Andy recognized that, and they began to form a friendship and began to work on these collaborative pieces. So they would start by working on a painting by themselves and then kind of trade it off to the other artists who would paint out what was there before, repaint something else, and be back and forth. And the effect was these really kind of tense and vibrant paintings where there is the desire of Andy to have very tight control images with really the explosive expression of Basquiat. And these are also interesting because for so long, Andy had kept his hand out of his paintings, right? There wasn't the mark of his brushstroke. In these paintings, he was actually painting by hand again. So it was a return to that form of painting. Now, this relationship grew some criticism, but also drew a lot of attention, as did his collaborations and friendship with other artists like Keith Haring as well. Keith Haring, obviously very well known for kind of his expressive, simple figures. He's everywhere again. My kids go to H&M, they come back with Keith Haring shirts. I'm like, oh, it's a Keith Haring shirt. They're like, no, it's an H&M shirt. I'm like, okay, we're both right. This is also at the time when Andy was having a show on MTV. He was modeling. He was so you would go through like a modeling book and you'd see all these young hunky men, and in the bottom would be this quirky, very pale, emaciated, gray hair wigged guy, and you're like, oh, who's going to sell our surfboard? That guy down there. He was also appearing in advertisements, as we mentioned, on TV. He was really everywhere in culture. In 1987, he had a show scheduled in Italy that was based around Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper work. Now, this show was suggested to him by the gallerist who gave him his first show at the Hugo Gallery in 1954. And in preparation for it, Andy actually found a postcard that was a tourist postcard that was a different artist's rendition of Da Vinci's masterpiece. And he used that as the basis for all of the images he created. So what we're looking at here is one of the pieces he created for that short. And this is actually a monumental canvas. So it's over 20 feet across, quite tall. So it's very large to scale. But he did different pieces that zoomed in as well, of showing different figures in this famous scene. Now, people, again, were skeptical. They thought that this was kind of a ploy, a money grab. The show, the space where he was having the show was not far from where the Da Vinci painting was. And people were always skeptical of Warhol because of his acceptance of the commercial and business side of his work. Artists like to look down on that a lot or use as an excuse why something maybe doesn't have value. But in recent years, there's been some reevaluation of this work. So Andy Warhol was probably one of the most known artists in the United States through the 1980s. And in the 1980s in New York and as across the world, creative communities were being devastated by the AIDS crisis, right? A lot of Andy's contemporaries were dying from AIDS, dealers were dying from AIDS. At the same time, the rest of the country didn't know much about this disease, was terrified of it, and really tried to ghettoize the disease, right? And so people dealing with it were very isolated, and with lack of information, there was a lot of mistrust and miscommunication about how it was spread, how you could not get it, and really what it was doing to you and how you did treat it. And he was criticized for not being an advocate or kind of drawing attention to the AIDS crisis. A lot of artists said, you know, you have such a platform, you should use that to speak out about what's happening in these creative communities. That was not really the personality of Andy Warhol, right? He was this marketer, he was very kind of quiet, soft-spoken, and he was always concerned about what other people thought of him, very aware of the public's reaction. And people thought he wouldn't take that on. Now, what does that have to do with this painting? Obviously, The Last Supper is in no way about the AIDS crisis, that story or the image. But we know that in our lives, there can be parallels between an image or a story and something not directly related through kind of the emotions or the situations that are being presented. So in The Last Supper, we have Jesus obviously dining his final meal with his disciples, where he is aware that someone from this close circle around him has betrayed him in a way that will lead to his death. And that painting is charged with that tension, that awareness that we know it and the central figure of that painting are aware of it. So within the scene, all the other figures arguing, talking, going over. There's only two people that know about that betrayal, Jesus, right, and Judas. But it's that tension in the painting. And if you think about even at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, for those of you unaware, COVID was a global pandemic that shut down the world for 2 years in recent history. Maybe you missed it. I don't know if you did. If you did, that's pretty great. But even at the beginning of that, where there's that sense of lack of understanding of what's happening, how you get it. Think about those early interactions you had with people when that was starting. I remember walking down the street and seeing someone on the other side of the street and being like, you know, maybe I should walk farther away. But in that moment of confusion and fear, there is that same tension. And I think it's a tension that existed within Andy and a lot of artists in the community in the world at that moment. So I don't think it's a coincidence that he was also drawn to this subject matter. At the same time, Andy was also not feeling very well himself. He had developed issues with his gallbladder, but because of kind of his fear of hospitals that were originally seeded with the death of his parents and also his experience obviously being shot, he had put off getting it treated. During the visit to Italy for the show, he was incredibly sick and uncomfortable. And finally, it was decided 1 month after the opening of the show, he would go in for gallbladder surgery. So 1 month after the show opened, he went in to have gallbladder surgery. He had surgery. It went fine. but then while he was recovering, he died in the hospital. The official line is that he died of heart failure, but we do know that the Warhol family settled out of court, and there is a lot of suggestion that the hospital was negligent and actually overhydrated him. So ironically, his fear of hospitals actually came out to be true. After Andy died, he had a funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral with over 2,000 attendees. And it was actually the first time that many of his close friends and peers realized that he had actually maintained his religion throughout his life, attending Mass regularly, and how that played a big role in who he was. But when I look back on Andy's story, in this arc that we're drawing, in this path that I'm kind of bringing you down, I think what's important to realize is that really for 40 years, he positioned himself at the front of visual culture, being a leading illustrator, being an artist incorporating new modes of representation, using existing imagery as the source of his work, something that we're very familiar with now, whether it's in music, film, fine art. His understanding that his own celebrity is a brand that can also push himself forward. He was just as aware of what he looked like, how he appeared, how he could stay in the news as he was what he made. Those are all things that exist everywhere now, right? We have social media stars, artists are polymaths, they work in video, they work in sculpture, they work in painting. Andy was ahead in all of those things. This is actually a picture of him experimenting with the Amiga painting program that also showed that, you know, he was already starting to embrace even computer new technologies. And he continues to stay in the news. And a lot of you may have heard about the controversy about the recent Supreme Court ruling against the Andy Warhol Foundation. And that is based on these works here. So on the left, you see a photograph by the photographer Lynn Goldsmith that was commissioned by Vanity Fair to accompany an article about the young artist musician Prince. And then shortly thereafter, Vanity Fair commissioned Warhol to do something about Prince as well. And they asked Lynn Goldsmith, can we use your photo as a basis for a Warhol illustration for the magazine? We'll pay for the rights. Yes, that's fine. And everything was fine until Lynn Goldsmith later found out that Andy also used that same image for the creation of several other works of the portrait. She sued what was then the Andy, she sued saying it was infringement of copyright. And then Andy Warhol Foundation argued that, well, this is the implementation of fair use. Fair use is an established practice that it says someone who takes an existing image and creatively changes it in a clear and obvious way to make it their own has not infringed on copyright. It's often used by artists and designers as the legal grounds for using existing source imagery. The Supreme Court actually ruled in favor recently of Lynn Goldsmith, saying that Warhol had in fact infringed on her copyright. Now, I say this is interesting and an interesting example of why Warhol continues to stay relevant, because this ruling comes at a time where the control and ownership of images is about to maybe become impossible to defend. And what do I mean is the advent of artificial intelligence and image generation. So a lot of people hear stories about AI creating image. You can go to a site or get a server and say, make a portrait of Justin Witte riding a pony through the ocean, and it will do that. You're like, well, it's magic. It's not magic. It's studied billions of images that are out there in the internet. It's making a conglomeration of those images. Okay? It is just piling them together, taking the keywords, searching those, mashing it together. And there are already artists who say, well, when you search certain things, it's clearly drawing from my artwork. So you're clearly infringing on my copyright. Now, the creators of AI say no, it's so broad, you can't prove it. So the Supreme Court is making a decision that goes back to a very rigid ownership of images at a moment when image ownership and control is about to become completely uncontrollable. And that puts Andy again at the forefront, because I will not be surprised when the first AI court or case makes its way to the Supreme Court, they will use his work as a basis for whatever argument So again, he's going to be at the forefront of visual culture as we enter. And that's why he's the subject of the show we're having at the Cleve Carney Museum of Art at the College of DuPage and the Mackinac Art Center. So we have been working basically since halfway through our Frida Kahlo show in preparation of this exhibition. And the idea was we actually have a large amount of Warhols in our permanent collection and had established a really great relationship with Bank of America that also has a large collection of his silkscreen works. When I proposed the show, I wanted to highlight our collection. And when we reached out to Bank of America, they were happy to lend their works as well. But as we did with the Frida Kahlo show, we know that we can't just always just put up the work, but we want to educate people because we're part of a college. So we've expanded this experience. We have a 2,500 square foot museum, but this exhibit covers over 11,000 square feet. So that means that we have designed, created, built out unique exhibits within Warhol that you can only see at the College of DuPage, including this very extensive historical exhibition, which tells a lot of the story I told you now, but shows examples from different periods of his life and also highlights some of the college's collection. Here you can see some photos from that space. And then in the museum itself, we have the works from Bank of America, which draw from different portfolios of work that he created, highlighting some from the soup cans, to his very popular endangered species series, and even collaborations with Keith Haring. Here's an example of some of the installation in that space. That's the endangered species series up there on the right. We also have examples of older interview magazines. We have the Andy Warhol Silver Clouds installation on display that we have got on loan from the Andy Warhol Museum. Silver clouds consist of large pillow-like balloons. And it was originally created by Andy Warhol working with an engineer from 3M to create these silver balloons. And he did it in response to another artist named Donald Judd, who had criticized Andy for his inability to make sculpture. Donald Judd makes very static, minimal, heavy metal sculptures. If you ever go to a museum and you see a stack of metal rectangles, that's a Donald Judd. Andy, as kind of a pushback, and being very clever and fun in the way that he was, said, well, I can make beautiful silver sculptures as well, except mine are going to float and you can walk through them and it's going to be a wonderful experience. So that's what the Silver Clouds is. We also have 157 photographs taken by Andy Warhol that are part of the college's collection that are on display that show both Polaroids he used in the preparation of his silkscreens, but also black and white snapshots that he took. He would walk around with a camera and take photos of his everyday life. So again, predicting the future, right? Pre-phone, but he was still just documenting every aspect. So these kind of give a glimpse into his everyday life along with how he created work. There's a really fun recreation of Studio 54 that shows some of the style and you get a sense of that period that Andy was also involved with. Studio 54 was a place where he gained a lot of clients for his portraits. And because we are now in a period that is outside of COVID, we also have a large amount of programming surrounding the show. So I mentioned Blake Gopnik, who wrote this Warhol book up on the right. He also writes for New York Times. He spoke at our opening day. We have Eric Shearer, who is a former museum director of the Warhol Museum, coming to speak. We have Jessica Beck, the former curator. She also features prominently in the Netflix show Andy Warhol Diaries. We have a whole slew of speakers coming to the college. A lot of the talks are on Thursday nights, but you get into them free if you have a ticket from attending the show. So if you go and you get a ticket or you have it on your phone, keep that and that will get you to any of the programming we have throughout the show. We also are engaging in different ways. So New Philharmonic, our resident orchestra, is doing a show inspired by Warhol at the Lakeside Pavilion. This weekend, we actually have a performance in the Lakeside Pavilion of anthems to celebrate Pride Month. And there's also, as you may have noticed, events going on throughout DuPage County. So we started by reaching out to community members in the wake of really Wheaton's wonderful engagement with the Frida Kahlo show, which was fantastic. We had this idea of, well, why don't we reach out to other communities in DuPage County and say, you know, why don't you identify 4 people from your community and we'll help you create a public art piece that presents them in a style similar to Warhol. The response has been amazing. So here's just some of the communities that have taken us up, and communities have really run with it. They've created different programs, different art shows, different events. And there's so many of them that we had to create a whole section on our website that lists them all. So if you're interested about what's going on around what's become this community-wide just programming and theme for the summer, you can go to our website, warhol2023.org, and we have lists for each community. It's also on the website where you can see all of our upcoming programming. And most importantly, it's where you can buy tickets to the exhibition so I can feed my children. So with that, I'm sorry I just went a little bit over, but I do have some time for questions.
Well,
So is there any questions?
Yes, thank you so much. So just a reminder, if you have a question and you're in our in-person audience, raise your hand and I'll come around to you. And I'm also just double checking my laptop here to see if there are any questions in the Q&A. If you are with our virtual audience, go ahead and open up that Q&A and enter your question there. Justin, as people are thinking and ruminating, I'm just wondering, as curator of this show, were there any particular challenges or joys about putting it together that you could tell us about?
Yeah, I think with any show, there's always challenges involved. I think one you might be surprised about with Warhol is for someone who made his career by using existing imagery. The Andy Warhol Foundation is very strict about the use of images related to Andy Warhol. And they've been, they've been great partners throughout the process, but there are very established routes to go to get the permission to even show anything related to it. So like in the historical exhibition where we have, close to 100 photographs from his life, we have his TV show, film, all of those you have to go through a process of approval. To the catalog we produced, recreation of representing images that are even on display in the show. You have to find the different, not only image right holders, but people who own the work. So there's an immense amount of work that goes into that. And then I think with any show, there's also just the physical reality of getting the work on site and installed in a secure way. That's always a stressful process because incredibly valuable things are being shipped across the country and coordinated and insured in all those aspects. But currently, probably the most challenging thing is keeping the silver cloud balloons inflated, to be honest.
Great. Any questions in the room? Yeah, just a moment.
How was he received in the rest of the world? He was very popular in the United States.
I've had this question before, and actually, he was recognized as very important overseas, probably before he was in the United States. And I think he has shown extensively, his work has been shown both when he was alive and when he's passed around the world. But I think that's because since his work is so much tied in with reflecting American culture, that those of us in it maybe don't have that perspective right away that's as easily viewed from outside. So people can understand that presentation, viewing it from the outside. I also think that when he was first making his work was pretty radical in the United States, and there was more acceptance for that type of like boundary pushing work overseas. But yeah, he's very well known throughout the world. I think the same overseas as maybe here's not as many people know his life story as much. They just kind of know his work and kind of this persona that he created. So, except people in Australia hate him for some reason. I'm just kidding. I don't know. I have no idea how they feel in Australia. If you're watching from Australia, I apologize.
There is a question from our virtual audience. They're commenting on the covers of the interview magazines. There's a little black ink scribble that appears, and they're just wondering about the origin of that, or if you could.
Those are though in that image. Those are his signature. Those are all signed copies. Yeah, but they're all kind of the same way, and they're sideways, so it looks. Let's see if we go back to it here. It looks like a little drawing or something, but they're just signatures.
Any other questions?
Yeah. There's the image.
Yes.
Is any of his family still left that's involved in this or no?
Well, the Warhols, there's still Warhols in Pittsburgh. It was a big family, and his brother stayed there throughout his life. So that name is still seen throughout the city. And he's actually been really embraced by the city. Like there's a Andy Warhol Bridge. Obviously, it's also home of the Andy Warhol Museum. But it's a known family in the city for sure. And that's where he's buried as well. And if you're curious about his gravesite, there's actually a 24/7 live cam of his of his burial site that you can see online.
Okay, I'm just going for another virtual question or two. Someone is asking, how did Bank of America come to collect his work?
Well, Bank of America, like a lot of institutions, first started collecting work like any company. They wanted to have work in their workspaces. But when you're around long enough, that means when you start to collect work in, say, the 60s, 70s, or 80s, some of that really grows in value and importance. And as Bank of America expanded and took in other partner banks or took over other banks, they also took in collections they may have. So they have amassed quite a large collection of work. And what they've decided to do is, instead of keep a lot of that work just within their corporate offices, to make it available to different communities to show and to create programming around. And that's why they have an Arts in Our Community program, which this collection comes from as well. So it's kind of a good way to use that work. But a lot of, if you go like downtown Chicago, if you ever walk by some of the large office buildings, pay attention to the art behind the desk, because even though it's behind the desk, you may notice like, oh, that's a pretty important piece. That's an Alex Katz, or that's, a Justin Witte or something like that.
Someone else is asking about the people on the cover of the interview magazines. How were they chosen, or how did Andy interact with them?
Well, the magazine was run like any magazine. So there, it was decided by who was kind of a big catch or a big person at that time. So it would be a lot of celebrities. You had people from Grace Jones to Michael J. Fox to Nancy Reagan. So it's really who was in the news at the moment. And then the images, people often wonder, were those made by Andy? No, those illustrations were not made by Andy Warhol, but they're obviously very influenced by him, and kind of his direction is seen in them as well.
Okay, well, this may be a good question to end with, because we're all anxious to come to the exhibit now. About how much time should someone allow for visiting the museum and getting to have a chance to interact there and experience the exhibit?
Yeah, I would say like 1 to 1.5 hours to experience the exhibit. There's a lot to take in, and there's different exhibitions within the space. But what's nice about it, taking advantage of the college campus, there's also a lot of nice places to take a break. And we have a wonderful courtyard in the back that we've transformed kind of into a central park to give it that New York feel, that actually has the same lampposts that we have that are in actual Central Park. So even though it takes that time, it is not a stressful or tense experience at all. So I don't know why it would be, but.
All right, well, thank you so much. Justin.
Thank you.
And just note that this program has been recorded. We'll put it up on the library's YouTube page within about a week. If you registered for this program, you will be receiving a follow-up email that includes some links, including that warhol2023.org website and some additional information as well. So thanks so much for joining us tonight. Take care, everybody.